Immediately to my right is the distinguished professor of history at Baruch and CUNY Graduate Center, Dr. Ervand Abrahamian, probably this country's leading scholar on matters of Iranian history in the 20th century. I can certainly recommend highly his most recent book, The Coup, which is about the Mossadegh period, and I think makes a compelling argument that it's about the oil, something that apparently was not raised previously. He will be talking about how this current period and agreement looks from inside Iran, and trying to frame this in the context of Iranian dynamics. To my further right is Professor at Hofstra of American Foreign Policy. She is currently writing a history of the American national security state during the Vietnam War, which we're hoping will be out either this year or early next year. She has also been, for the last 8 years, leading United for Peace and Justice's legislative work and is co-convener of the legislative task force. So she will be speaking informed by that history. Let me say that we are meeting at a time in which the United States and Iran have at least momentarily eschewed the idea of going to war and are talking. There is as we all know, I think, a deal that was worked out whereby the Iranians agreed to keep their enrichment of nuclear materials below a 20% level in return for the lifting of about $8 or $9 billion worth of the $60+ billion of sanctions over the next year. A second round of talks is about to move forward on that, and we therefore have some optimism about this. However, I will let Professor Abrahamian start and tell us why there may not be as much optimism as I just indicated. Professor?
Well, as you all know, the interim agreement has been agreed to, and I'm actually optimistic that within a year we'll get a full agreement. The danger comes, of course, from Congress and some irresponsible senators, including our own, who might try to throw a spanner into the works. But even here, I think they're not going to succeed. So on the whole, I'm optimistic that an agreement will be achieved within a year. Now, what's the reason for this optimism? I think the reason is that both administrations, the Obama administration and the Rouhani administration, are really on the same page on this issue. They were on the same page in that they're willing to come to a compromise, which would then actually settle the nuclear issue. Now, often it's become a mantra in the media that it's the sanctions that have forced Iran to come to the table and come to an agreement. This has been said so many times that it needs to be basically challenged. If you look at what the Iranian position, Iran was willing to come to a similar agreement years ago. In fact, the same person, Rouhani, and his now foreign minister, Zarif, offered very similar agreements to the Bush administration. And it was the Bush administration that refused to deal with them at that time. So the Iranian position has not changed. Even before sanctions, they were willing to come to an agreement on this issue. In fact, Jack Straw just recently, the former foreign minister of Britain, revealed that in his negotiations, he agreed with Rouhani with the settlement. The French foreign minister also agreed. The Bush administration vetoed it. And Blair, the Prime Minister of Britain, then reacted by dismissing, actually, Jack Straw. So that was basically the end of that agreement. So long before sanctions, the Iranian position was that they're willing to actually come to an agreement acceptable where they would not go into weaponization. So the question becomes, two questions, is what is the Iranian policy? And the second is, why has the US administration changed its position, i.e. contrasting the Obama administration to the Bush administration? I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to figure out what the Iranian policy is. The Iranian policy is not to have a nuclear weapons, not to have something at hand, but to have the capability that if ever they're again invaded and attacked as they were by Saddam Hussein, they would have the capability of deterrence. For them, the formative war experience was in 1988 when Saddam Hussein used actually chemical weapons on Iran, and the international community didn't raise a finger about it. In fact, the State Department said that this was all phony, the Iranians were making it up. And then when Iranians produced basically injured bodies in Germany for the hospitalization, the State Department argued, well, the Iranians had used it on themselves in order to get public international sympathy. In fact, they were taking Saddam Hussein off the hook. It wasn't until Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the day after that, the State Department admitted that, yes, years before, Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons on Iran. So from that experience, I think the Iranian elite believes that to have security in the long term, you should have the capability of being able to have a deterrence if need be. Of course, there is no immediate danger of Iran being invaded now, nor in the near future, but who knows in the long distance what will happen. In Iraq, you could very well have another Saddam Hussein, or even worse, a Shiite sort of Alawi, who would be even more dangerous for Iran. So in the long-term security, I'm sure the Iranian elite thinks that it's best to have the capability of having a nuclear weapon in the long terms if once pushed to the corner. Now, this sounds very sinister and dangerous, but there are about 30 countries in the world that have the capability of putting a nuclear weapon together. The typical example would be Japan. People say that Japan all needs is a long weekend to produce a weapon together. So technically, it's not. Japan is not a nuclear state, but it could be if it wanted to. And there are plenty of other states that do it. And of course, no one is proposing that U.S. should attack every country, the 30 countries that have capability in order to disarm. So that in a whole is the Iranian position. So when they say that they're not interested in a nuclear weapon, they're actually being honest. They're not interested in putting a weapon at hand, but what they want to have the scientists, they want to have the centrifuges, they want to have limited amount of uranium and the knowledge to be able to put those together if ever they need to do it. And this makes the common sense, and I think it's quite a rational, basically, perspective in terms of Iranian national interest. Now, for Israel and the Bush administration, this capability was intolerable. For them, the position was that Iran should have no nuclear program at all. Shouldn't have any nuclear scientists, shouldn't have any centrifuges, shouldn't have any enrichment. In fact, the Israeli policy was to assassinate as many Iranian physicists as they can. There are a whole series of scientists in Tehran who have been assassinated clearly by Israel. And their bottom line is basically Iran should have no nuclear knowledge whatsoever, because that knowledge can become capability, and capability can eventually become a threat to Israel. And as long as the Bush administration supported that position, then obviously there was no possibility of a deal between Iran and United States, because Iran, there was no way it was going to dismantle all its nuclear program. It had its national prestige attached to it. It has its security attached to it. So as long as that was the U.S. position, there was no way of coming to an agreement. So what has changed really is not the Iranian position, is the US administration's position. Obama has been actually quite consistent even before he came to the White House. He made it clear that he was opposed to Iran having a nuclear weapons, but he was not opposed to Iran having a nuclear program. This was a clear distinction that he made, and it was a clear distinction he made between himself and the Bush administration. And having come to office, he basically was willing to pursue this. The first few years, it was hard to do it because the president in Iran was Ahmadinejad, who actually was willing to negotiate, but he had already so much baggage with him that it was very difficult with the Obama administration to take him seriously on the negotiation. Even that, there were actually quiet negotiations, secret negotiations in Oman with the Ahmadinejad administration. But when Rouhani was elected, then that was a nice opening for this administration to actually then step in and to make it clear that they were willing to tolerate an Iranian nuclear program as long as Iran gave guarantees that that nuclear program would not develop into a nuclear weapons program. So this has been actually quite consistent in Obama's policy. In other areas he may have been inconsistent, but on Iran he has been actually very consistent. Another thing about the Obama administration is a speech Obama made to the United Nations General Assembly in September last year, which can be actually billed as an Obama doctrine. It wasn't billed as such. There wasn't much publicity given to it. But it's a very interesting document where he actually spells out what are U.S. core interests. This is a phrase he constantly uses, core interests in the Middle East. And what's significant in that is he doesn't list things such as Israel as a core interest or megalomaniac notions of spreading democracy and so on. He very much limits core interests as American national interests in the region. And the two he stresses is one, the diplomatic settlement of the nuclear issue, and actually also mentions the settlement of the Palestinian issue as a U.S. core interest in the region. So with these basically changes in American foreign policy, it was obviously an opening for the Rouhani administration to offer another olive branch, which was of course quickly grabbed in the White House, and negotiations started for a settlement. And what the U.S. was demanding from Iran was, of course, verifiable guarantees, monitoring about the nuclear program, that the nuclear program wouldn't become a weapons program, which Iran is actually willing to give, and that's what basically the negotiations are on now. And I don't see any difficulties in that, because basically they have the will to actually, or the desire to come to a settlement, so technical difficulties can easily be solved on that issue. The problem, of course, comes in Israel, and of course the representatives of AIPAC in the Congress. For Israel, their security rests in having no other country in the Middle East having nuclear capability. They want a monopoly of nuclear capability. And if Iran has that capability, that is perceived in the Netanyahu administration as a potential threat. So this brings basically a conflict of national interests between the United States and Israel. For U.S., it's not a threat to the United States if Iran has long-term capability. For Netanyahu's administration, the perception is that capability is a threat to Israel. So then the question becomes, whose policy should the United States pursue? Is it US policy or Israeli policy? Well, there are obviously people in Congress who echo AIPAC and Israel and argued that basically no agreement is good agreement with Iran, that basically Iran should be forced to either capitulate or regime change, or basically sanctions increased until Iran dismantles all its nuclear program. And of course, this administration in Washington has come to the conclusion, I think rightfully, that no amount of pressure is going to force Iran to actually dismantle, and more pressure is not going to lead to regime change. In fact, another thing that I should have mentioned in the Obama's UN speech is he did deny any desire for regime change. So that's not on the table. It's not part of their program, which it had been in previous administrations in Washington. So congressmen who are echoing AIPAC are actually stepping on very thin ice. Because when it comes to push to the shove, the question is whose interest should American foreign policy be? Should it be in US foreign policy interest, or should it be in the Israeli foreign policy interest? You can say from the Israeli point of view, yes, Iran should not have the capability, but since it's not really the same for US interests, then why should US get involved in a war when it's not in its interest to do so? So you have actually a strange situation where Israel and Saudi Arabia are volunteering US to attack Iran. Well, if they want to really seriously attack Iran, why don't they do so themselves? Why should the United States be involved in such a war for their interests? And obviously from the US point of view, which the US president can argue if it comes to ready to push to the shove, he can very well go to the public, American public, and say, here, this is our national interest. I'm a president. I'm espousing national interest. There are congressmen who then are not actually espousing American national interest. Who is the public going to support? So this is going to put very much congressmen in the corner, because they obviously would not want to go against US president, especially their own Democratic president, on an issue that is of vital interest to the United States, but to go to war for the interests of some other country. We're actually coming to the 100th anniversary of 1914. One lesson historians and politicians learned, and more politicians have forgotten about the lesson of 1914, is that we don't let small allies run the policy of major powers, especially if small allies are trigger happy and eager to go to war. The lesson people learned from August 1914 is smaller allies dragged major powers into a war when it wasn't really in the interest of the major powers to do so. This was very much a lesson my generation learned. It's now dropped out of the books, and congressmen, of course, don't know this lesson, but I think the White House and the occupant of the White House now very much knows about this. Well, why else would he stress so much in his UN speech about US needing to follow core interests? And if it's not in the core interest of the United States to go to war, why should it go to war for the interests of some ally or some other country, especially if it's in the interests of Israel or Saudi Arabia? I'll stop there.
I've been asked to really talk about the congressional aspect of this. Now, for the last 2 or 3 weeks, a lot of people here in Brooklyn, even, and around the country have been mobilized against this bill, which is S1881. And probably 3 weeks ago, nobody ever heard of it. But how many of you actually have made calls to the Senate in the last 2 or 3 weeks? Okay, so so this thing that no one ever heard of, has suddenly become a big deal. And actually, these phone calls about S1881 have been going across, the whole country. Folks who are working on Capitol Hill are saying that there's really been a shift. Initially, the APEC calls were very dominant, but people are saying now that the calls have been running about 10 to 1 in the other direction. So, that's a positive thing. But S1881, probably everyone here will have forgotten it by next week, hopefully, because that bill might be dead, partly thanks to all the phoners. But what I thought I would do today is actually try to sort of touch on 3 things, 2 of which are a little broader than just S1881. And one is I would like to talk a little bit about the role of Congress historically and specifically during the Vietnam era in affecting issues of war and peace. I want to say a little bit about that. Then I want to do a little second segment about what has been the role of Congress since 9/11 and what has been our role in affecting Congress since 9/11, and then come back to what we're in right now and what are the dangers of what we're in, and also what are some of the opportunities. So in my non-spare time, I've been writing this book about the national security state during the Nixon-Kissinger era. And what that involves is reading a huge amount of declassified documents, things that were locked up forever. And suddenly they're not locked up anymore, and you can see a lot of things about what was going on that you really didn't necessarily know at the time. And as a researcher, one of the things that most surprised me as I was reading these declassified records, really surprised me, was how important Congress was in pushing the Nixon-Kissinger administration, how important it was in shaping their decisions, how they thought about Congress all of the time. And in fact, I think became clear to me at a certain point that because of their concern about Congress, they actually began withdrawing U.S. troops from Vietnam, really from the 4th month they were in power going on. And I was very surprised about this because as an activist, and I see there are some people here that look like they're my age, so you will remember. I didn't even, as an activist back then in the anti-war period, I didn't want to talk about Congress. I never did one thing about Congress. I felt like Congress was horrible. It's an imperialist war. They have these stupid resolutions. They never pass. They never do anything. And if you want to get something done, you're in the streets or you're demonstrating. And in fact, if I just a little biographical detail here, Molly Nolan, who's in the back at the table, she and I became friends because literally we met in a jail cell. And if somebody had said to me, for example, back then, I think you should work for Senator Goodell, because he's really important, and would you please work on that? Like, no way am I going to do that. I know that's a waste of time. He's not going to do it. So lo and behold, when I'm reading all these documents, I'm suddenly realizing how incredibly important Congress actually was at that time and shaping what the administration did, and very concretely in doing something that as a peace activist I also paid no attention to, which is that when Nixon came in, there were 550,000 troops in Vietnam, U.S. troops in Vietnam, and by 1972 they were down to 60,000. Now at the time, me and everybody else I knew said, oh, well, we don't care about that. He's in Cambodia, he's in Laos, it's horrible, it's all a fake. But actually, to most people in this country, taking out 460,000 men and bringing them home was kind of a big deal. And part of why they did that was because of Congress. Now, if you're sitting here thinking about it, you say, well, okay, but that's because it was a mass movement, right? If it wasn't a mass movement, the Congress wouldn't have been so great. And we didn't even know it was great. But, and that's absolutely true. I mean, there's no question that Congress didn't just come out of nothing. But the thing that I really have learned by looking at that record is that while Congress didn't come out of nowhere, it was an important ingredient in affecting policy. And when it was proactive, it moved things in a certain direction. And when it wasn't proactive, things stood still regardless of what was happening in the streets. So that was actually one of the things that I learned, and it doesn't mean that we're exactly in the same time right now. I don't want to just make a fake analogy. But it did sort of open me up to the possibility that actually Congress might be more important than I thought. And the second thing that I learned from doing this research, which I think is applicable to today, is that what I began to realize is that it didn't matter a lot of the time if you passed a resolution, if a bill passed. Nothing passed during the Vietnam War. And some people think they did, it didn't. The only thing that passed in the whole time while there were US troops on the ground was the Cooper Church Amendment, which those old folks might remember, that prohibited the United States from sending ground troops into Laos and Cambodia. That was the only thing that passed. Congress eventually bans American troops in Vietnam, but it does it after all the troops are home. Okay, so nothing passed. And so that's why, people and everyone I knew was really crabby, like, they never pass anything. I don't want to hear about the Hatfield-McGovern Amendment again. It never passes, end of story. But what I began to understand is that whether it passed or not, things can still have a big influence. And that part of what was shaping policy at that time was the fear by the administration that if they didn't keep pulling out troops, if they didn't keep doing that, then they were going to have a very serious problem in Congress. And Richard Nixon had a phrase for what they were caught in. And that phrase is, we're just 3 steps ahead of the sheriff. Okay? Because that's what they felt they were doing, is that they were avoiding congressional action that would be a problem by having to do things that actually they would not have done. They were not interested, and certainly Kissinger was not interested in taking troops out at all. But that push really mattered. Now, I could say a lot more about it, but I want to move us forward. But what I'm saying is, I didn't learn from history that history repeats itself. And whenever I start class, I ask kids, why are you in this class? And I say history repeats itself, and it actually doesn't. But not really. But if it builds enrollments, I guess it's a good thing. But there's enough similarities in things that happen in the past that you can learn from it. And I guess what I would say, to oversimplify a lot, is that what I really learned from reading all these classified documents, seeing Congress driving the president absolutely crazy, even though they're passing nothing, okay? Seeing how somebody like Charles Goodell, who I gave about 3 seconds of my time to in those days, was really driving them crazy, was a terrible threat to them. It at least opened me to the possibility that in the period that we're now in, that some of the same facts might be applicable, even though Congress is in many ways very different from what it was back then. So I'll just say that general thing. If anybody has water, that would help me to get to segment 2. Okay. So let me then move on a little bit and to a second piece, because I think it's important. I think it's important to have this in mind as we think about this Iran situation. Since 9/11, I would imagine that if we polled everybody in this room, we would all probably agree Congress has been horrible, right? From rubber stamping this idiotic, call to war in Iraq that made absolutely no sense, from the Patriot Act. I mean, probably everyone here has a list of all the horrible things Congress has done, all the ways that they've failed. Okay? And that list is certainly there. But that doesn't mean that Congress has, it doesn't mean that Congress has been irrelevant or that nothing has been accomplished. And I know I keep hearing people all the time say, oh, I called them. I've been calling them for 7 years. Nothing ever happens. But I don't think that that's true. And I think that all those bills that always lose, Barbara Lee, McGovern, Jeff Merkel, whatever, Merkley, these bills that we always call up about and don't pass, I think have had a profound impact on both administrations in terms of the fact that it creates a climate where it becomes difficult to expand the American war effort in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and even where there's been a surge, because obviously there was a surge in Iraq and Obama, ended up having a surge in Afghanistan. So these things happen. But even so, it was a very specific kind of surge, time limited. Right? And certainly Obama's was time limited, which is why Gates is writing such a nasty, memoir right now, is because Obama, put limits on it. And so what I'm suggesting is that even though we never win, that I don't think people should conclude from that our activities are actually, irrelevant. I think that they have exercised a kind of downward pressure, you know, that in a way it's a dog that didn't bark. I haven't read this book, so, you know, my reputation as a pundit could go right down the tubes, but I want to predict that the Gates book, that we know from all the reviews that he hates Congress, right? He's already said that. And I would be willing to bet that in the middle of all that book is going to be all his complaints about the way in which Congress intervened to slow down the American project in Iraq and Afghanistan. And if only they had minded their own business, they could have, you know, gone, you know, in that direction. So I guess what I want to argue as a sort of a broad perspective is not to just rewrite history. It's not to pretend that things have gone phenomenally well since 9/11. But I think that in recognizing that, we should also recognize, you know, when there have actually been victories. And that somebody like Barbara Lee, for example, and, you know, every day she wakes up and thinks of something new to do. Right? And we try to support her all the time. She has been enormously important and effective in at least putting a lid on things and also creating an environment in which, in fact, we are going to slowly get out of Afghanistan. Should we be getting out of there right now? Yes. If we did more, could we help that process? Yes. But nevertheless, there has been progress in that, you know, in that arena, and I think the work that people have done around the country has mattered. And, you know, as somebody that I've monitored the email traffic that's coming in from around the country, so I get to see some stuff that other people might not. And, you know, time and time again, you know, we'll get reports from groups just like Brooklyn for Peace. You know, we went to see Congressman blah, they didn't, you know, they seemed bored, they read a newspaper, they didn't care what we said, but we went back again. And, you know, 3 months later, that annoying congressperson might have really changed. And, you know, you're kind of seeing that, so that the work we're doing here in Brooklyn, we're not the only people doing that work. People are doing it around the country. It's having some effect. It should have more. You know, one of the implications of what I said about how Congress doesn't have to pass bills in order to affect policy, that could be positive, but it could also be negative. Sometimes that works on behalf of peace. Sometimes it works the opposite way. Story of AIPAC, right? AIPAC has been able to exert enormous influence through all these members of Congress that they have corralled, even when they don't pass a bill, right? But the factor of intimidation and their ability to, you know, call out members of Congress when needed, it acts as a constraint on government policy. It's part of why the president, you know, whether it's Bush or whether it's Obama, found it very difficult. Even when they want to move on Israel-Palestine, they're paralyzed. And when they're trying to move on Iran, up until now, they've been almost paralyzed. And that one of the reasons for that, whether you have a bill or you don't have a bill, is because of that power of AIPAC that has really made it difficult to have the kind of flexibility that we actually need to have in order to have a decent policy, in order to settle, you know, any of these issues. So I think we have to also keep that in mind, that that's hanging over all of this. And obviously from the point of view of Israel, and as Jed was just talking about from the point of view of AIPAC, they don't want to deal with Iran. And, you know, whether or not they even, you know, how effective they ultimately are on the nuclear issue, if nothing else, if you keep sanctions on, right, for, you know, however, forever, and Iran is a mess and it's weak, that's good. I mean, that's really what, you know, that's really what we're dealing with. Now, I think, and you know, I want to support what Jed said, I think there really is a change in the administration. I think that Obama actually is changing in a number of ways. I think he actually is trying to change certain policies. Okay, and I think he's sick of, you know, he really wants us to not have ground wars. I think he wants to make a deal with Iran. I think he wants to diffuse that situation. He might actually want to make some changes between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but certainly he's moving forward on this Iran front and trying to get a negotiation. Okay, and so what's happened? Well, AIPAC has gone crazy. So they have introduced this S-1881, and the bill is nothing but destructive. In terms of, it really does introduce new sanctions, so it would violate the interim agreement. It sets up all kinds of conditions that the Iranians have to fulfill that are not in that interim agreement. And very importantly, it doesn't commit us to attacking Iran, but what it does say is if Israel feels that in its self-defense it needs to attack Iran, we will support them. It's not binding, okay, but it's essentially signaling to the Israeli government, if it passes, that we've got your back, So, I mean, there's a ton of bad things in it. And what I think should be emphasized is that as of 2 weeks ago, it looked like it was going to pass. Okay, I really want people to understand. People thought it was going to pass. Schumer and Menendez went behind it. They got 14 Democrats to line up right away. Then all of the Republicans lined up because they always wanted to ruin anything that Obama does. So it doesn't even matter. They don't need AIPAC for the Republicans. They all signed on to the bill. That's why they got up to 59. But then an interesting thing happened. For the first time that I can remember, the Obama administration pushed back against AIPAC, right? They haven't done it before. They did it this time. And they also were able to get all these Democratic chairs, whether it's, Barbara Boxer or Dianne Feinstein. All these people always take terrible positions on these things, but Carl Levin. But all these people said, no, this bill is not good. This bill will ruin negotiations. This isn't the time for it. And so there's a kind of a firewall. And part of that was built by the administration. But the other part of it was built by us. And people really need to understand that. In other words, that there were senators. We haven't been able to do that so well here. We have the toughest job in some ways. But, that there were a lot of senators who were all set to sign on. And this was going to be a done deal. And they were going to have a vote. And it would be veto-proof and blah, blah, blah. Okay, and then people really rallied at the grassroots all across this country with lots of organizations. And I think, one thing that should be said, maybe controversial, but J Street, I think, has been very important in that in terms of the stuff that they've done on Capitol Hill. So for the first time, there was both pushback from the White House and there was pushback from the peace movement. And as of this minute, that bill is stalled. So that's kind of where we are. But I'm a little less optimistic than Jed. Than Ervand about this, because it's good that this is happening. It's good that this, something is finally, stop this juggernaut. But the reality is that at any stage, this can come unraveled. If AIPAC pries 3 more senators onto the other side, then you have a different situation. The other thing that may very well happen, and this is really relevant to us in Brooklyn, is that Cantor, that because it's stuck in the Senate, Cantor, always looking for trouble, they try to introduce it in the House, okay? And by creating momentum in the House, then put more pressure on the Senate. So that's something that could be coming. A lot of people feel that the real pushback is going to come right at the beginning of March, when AIPAC, brings its literally thousands of people to Capitol Hill. Literally thousands are going to swarm over Capitol Hill. There'll be new legislative initiatives. So if they haven't managed to derail things before March 1st, they're going to try like hell to do it then. So there's a lot of difficulty along the way. And one other point that I think is very important to keep in mind, this was said on a conference call yesterday, is that apart from the immediate thing, here's what's at the end of the day. If the United States reaches an agreement with Iran on this issue, all of the sanctions come off. You have to believe that the Israeli government and AIPAC is going to do everything in its power to make sure those sanctions don't come off, because they could have those sanctions forever. So, those are some of the longer, term things that we have to deal with. But I want to conclude with a little bit of what Jed was saying and sort of expand it, which is, it's a precarious moment. We have a president trying to change policy, right? And so there really is movement. And we have people all around the country that are working on that. And that's really exciting. But, it is a dangerous time. However, it's also a time of opportunity. And I think this is especially relevant here in Brooklyn, okay? Because up until now, AIPAC writes the script. This summer, when there was an absolutely idiotic resolution from the House adding more sanctions on Iran, every single one of our congresspeople voted for it. Every single one of them. It was 400 to 20 in the House. Okay, and truthfully, when you really talk to some of our congresspeople about did they really, really think that was an important bill, no. They are yielding totally to political pressure by AIPAC. Here in Brooklyn, our members of Congress are have allowed themselves to be absolute prisoners of AIPAC. And I think the opportunity that we have now, that we maybe haven't had before, is that they're overstepping. And frankly, Charles Schumer is overstepping. And Jill Brand is overstepping, although I think she probably regrets that she just followed Schumer into this, because most of her colleagues are saying no now. Right? She didn't exactly know that was going to happen. Okay, but they are overstepping because they, on this Iran issue, it is a clear-cut case of putting Netanyahu's idea of Israeli national interest in ahead of the American, of our own national interest. And we should push back on that. This is a chance to do bigger education, not just to win around S1881, but to do real education about what people in Brooklyn and in New York need from their elected officials in terms of a policy that is in the interest of our country and in the interest of, frankly, all the people in the Middle East. That this is something we can begin to put on the table. We should be counterattacking AIPAC right now. We should be counterattacking on Schumer. Who are you standing for? Are you standing for people in Brooklyn? Or are you standing for people in Tel Aviv? It is absolutely outrageous, the role that he's actually played on this. So, you know, partly what I see in this is an opportunity as well as a danger. And it's also the opportunity to appropriately link Israel-Palestine issues, which we need to do. Right? That in terms of Israel-Palestine, I mean, the essential way in which our legislators, you know, the role that they play is as enablers of Israel and the worst policies of Israel, and giving them a blank check, giving them all the money they want. They need an Iron Dome, defense, whatever. Give it to them, right? And we should be fighting against that. And this opening, this overstepping by AIPAC gives us an opportunity, really, to make that fight and to broaden it so that we're really raising much bigger questions about the U.S. policy in the Middle East across a spectrum of issues and not just one. Thanks.
I would like to stress that there, I mean, from what Rusty is saying is, the conclusion can be very pessimistic, because if Congress plays such an important role, however many phone calls we make, we're not going to compete with AIPAC. So AIPAC's policy is then basically no deal with Iran and even war. So that policy is going to win in Congress, however much noise we make. But if one looks at it in terms of national interest and what the president articulates as national interest, that is then going to put, I think, AIPAC and the war, basically, party in a corner. In the past, Israel could always say, well, Israeli interests are the same as U.S. interests, so there's no contradiction. But here, I think you are right. AIPAC has overstepped itself. Here, there is actually a clear-cut conflict between U.S. foreign interest and Israeli foreign interest. So are congressmen really going to represent American interests or Israeli interests or Saudi interests? On that point, I mean, I think this administration is willing to play hardball. If it comes to the crush, they can go to the pulpit and talk about this is what the president articulates as U.S. interests. We need to have an agreement. The Iranians are willing to agree. So why shouldn't we agree because Israel doesn't want to agree? On that level, I think AIPAC will be put in a corner. One can also see indications from actually people in the foreign policy establishment that over the years they've got so actually angry at AIPAC over a host of issues that is also actually breaking basically taboos in Washington. You hear actually people from the Clinton administration, high-ranking people, saying that there are two evil organizations in the United States. One is the NRA, the other is AIPAC. Now, this is not a man in the street saying that. This is how people, high senior officials from previous administrations. So when it comes to a question of especially war and national interest, this administration, I think, is willing to actually play very hardball with AIPAC on this issue.
This administration has never played hardball on anything. I mean, there's not been a great track record in terms of its firmness. So I think, you know, I don't feel like all magic resides there. I think there's a willingness to be tougher and stronger than they have been in the past. I think that that's the case. But Congress can easily tie them up. And my point is that we can defeat AIPAC. But the administration can't just do that by going on television. And they're not going to be as brazen as you think because, again, there's presidential election ahead and there's Florida and, so forth. So, I don't think it's correct to say, or maybe it's a difference of emphasis. I think the administration is willing to push, but I think we have to be willing to fight. And if there is not a grassroots mobilization with the Congress, then I actually do think we're going to lose. But I think we can win. But we're not going to win in a half-assed way. We're not going to win by just doing a little something and then doing 20 other things and forgetting about it. It really has to be a sustained effort. Most people in Brooklyn, for example, are clueless, right, about what their members of Congress do on this. They don't know anything. And so there's a whole job to be done. So I don't know if we really disagree, but I think it has to be, we're getting movement at the top. I think that's great, but it's not enough. And I think the question is, is there an ability at the grassroots to really do some significant fight back? And I don't know if we really disagree or...
Well, I mean, I'm more optimistic. Even if, let's say, Congress sabotages this deal, you have a U.S. president agreeing with the Iranian president that the deal is possible. Congress says no. Okay, so what happens? The U.S. no longer runs the world. The rest of the countries in the world are going to actually break the sanctions. The whole system is going to unravel. So here you have actually a question of political reality. This administration is much more in touch with limitations of American power. Congress lives in its own world. It really thinks that it can basically dictate to the rest of the world. In fact, I think in the Obama speech is one thing that it becomes clear. He stresses the limitations of U.S. power. In that way, I think that this is a very realistic assessment of it. Already, actually, countries like Britain are more than eager to break sanctions. They're running off to Iran to make deals. So if the U.S. president, the Iranian president, come to a deal, why should they listen to Congress and continue with sanctions? So it will actually unravel U.S. power if Congress tries to sabotage the president's position.
What we should be asking this weekend, the Peace Action's having a conference in Washington, D.C. We're going to be down there from different parts of the country. And on Monday, the plan is to go to Capitol Hill and lobby around, partly about Iran and some other things. What should the message be this weekend?
Well, it depends on whether you're lobbying in the House or the Senate. If you're talking to the Senate, I think it's still relevant to talk, definitely relevant to talk about S1881, because even if it's dead today, it could be alive in 2 minutes. And so, members of the Senate who have signed on as a co-sponsor, and we just did that with Gillibrand, and I think we should keep going. We should be asking them to reconsider or to make a statement saying that it's not timely to vote on this bill right now. So you want to ask folks, who are doing that. There is now, I think, about 28 or 29 senators, most of them Democrats, who said they will not sign on to this bill at all, so you say thank you. And there's another 15 or 16. It's very easy, Sally, to get. There's a whip list that's very easily available, and if anybody wants that, happy to tell you how to get that. But everybody's using the same whip list. So, thank you if you're saying I don't support this. Rethink it if you are. And very crucial of those people who haven't said anything, because they could still shift. If you have an undecided senator, then you say, but this is really national, I'm sorry. Undecided, this is a terrible bill, whatever. If you're talking to people in the House, I think that the Cantor bill is like 5 seconds from being introduced. The message to any member of Congress, and that we're doing our open letter, and I think at some point we should be, get even more signatures and then visit them all here in Brooklyn. Our message to them is absolutely no legislation designed to undermine these negotiations. That we regard those negotiations as the most hopeful thing that's happening internationally, and that we would strongly encourage members of Congress to promote this diplomacy, not to interfere with it. Judge,
you want to add?
Yeah, I would ask your congressmen, the ones who are criticizing the administration, to be precise. What is their criticism? Not general things, well, we can't trust mullahs or we can't trust Muslims. Be precise. What is it about the negotiations you don't like?
Okay.
This business about the exclusion of Iran from the Syria negotiations, which is much in the news today.
Sorry?
The exclusion of Iran from the Syria talks at behest of the U.S. Does that at all threaten the ongoing talks between the United States and Iran? Is there any connection at all?
No, I mean, if it was like Ahmadinejad so in Iran, of course they would use this as a good reason not to continue and say, well, you know, this is a slap in our face and so on. But the present administration, Rouhani and Zarif, are sophisticated enough to know that it's actually, they have their eyes on the nuclear negotiations. As long as U.S. has the eyes on that, Syria is a side issue. And actually, I'm glad that Iran is not involved in the negotiations, because the Syrian negotiations are not going to go anywhere. And then people here would easily blame Iran for it. And you don't want to entangle other issues with the nuclear issue. If U.S. brings in Hezbollah or Syria, Iran can then bring in other issues, and it'll get so entangled with other issues, you'd never resolve the nuclear issue.
I'm looking at the international situation. Germany, a lot of different countries are in there already. And one of the pieces of Iran that doesn't get talked about when we're talking about the politics is that Iran has more natural gas than any other country in the world by a humongous amount. And it seems to me that a lot of those countries are going to want to get at that gas and make deals with Iran, and that there might be oil and gas interests at work here in the United States on both sides, both the fracking community, which doesn't want that gas released, and the oil and gas industry in general that might like to be able to get in there to help Iran develop it. Do you see any of this having any importance in the current situation?
But it's a constant issue. I mean, I think in the past also, Iranian administrations thought that because gas was so important, it would trump other issues in the United States, like it would trump APEC and so on. So you have to be always balanced that yes, gas and oil is important, but it doesn't really determine policy. But clearly, for a lot of companies, opening up of Iran is going to be profitable, and American companies would be like to get into that. Like the mistake an administration made in Iran right after the revolution was Rafsanjani's administration. They dangled the issue of oil, and they thought that would really basically get United States to do anything they wanted. And clearly oil wasn't then the Trump issue for the U.S. administration.
In the rhetoric within Iran, is the argument still draw any power that the U.S. has so much blood on its hands in its dealings with Iran, first Mossadegh, and then apparently we could argue, is it generally accepted that the U.S. directed Iraq to invade Iran?
Yes, I mean it's not revved up, the rhetoric, but it's something that everyone knows. It's basically, you can say, part of culture. But I don't think the policy makers are actually in a straitjacket on those issues. So they're quite willing to be quite pragmatic on other issues. Say, well, this is a historical event, we can deal with that. But there are more issues at hand, like the nuclear issue is far more serious and immediate than what's happened before. And actually in that speech, interestingly enough, Obama's speech, he did mention the CIA coup. But he, of course, said it happened during the Cold War. Of course, in the Cold War, you could throw your grandmother under the bus, he says, because of the Cold War. But by mentioning it, it was, again, a concession to Iran.
Let's make a little bit of analogy maybe between the Israeli-Palestinian question and how strong they've been and how they've gotten everything they want. Now, this agreement is an interim agreement, and that should be very clear. And Iran, if in fact there's a final agreement, Iran will still have the capacity to build a nuclear weapon. And they should, right, as 30 other countries in the world have the capacity, like Japan. When you have a final agreement, it's going to be quite different than an interim agreement.
The final agreement is clear. Iran will have a nuclear program, but not a nuclear weapons program. Okay? So what's Israel going to say? That Iran can't even have a nuclear program? The U.S. president agrees with Iran having a nuclear program.
Of course that's what they're going to say. They're going to say that they have the capacity to have a nuclear weapon in a month or 2 months, and that we can't trust them, and that we can't have this agreement because it's going to, well, it's not in the interests of Israel, and then it's not in the interests of the United States. You know, we all know the arguments, what they're going to give. Well, the question is, can we counter these arguments, and can we build a mass movement that's going to make sure that we know the distinction between what the interim agreement and their arguments that are going to be on the final.
Well, the final agreement won't be like that Iran will have the capacity in 1 month or 2 months. It will have a theoretical capacity in the long term, maybe in 10 years to do it. And if that's acceptable to the U.S. Administration, what's Israel going to do about it? Okay, the U.S. can say, well, Israel doesn't like it, you can go and attack Iran. Don't count on us.
What Israel's going to do is it's exactly what they've been doing on the Palestinian question. They control.
But they don't control Iran.
What?
They don't control Iran.
No, that's my point. That's my point. The point is how it's going to be destroyed if we allow them to destroy it. That's only. I mean, I think we agree on that. The question then becomes how we frame the issue and how we prepare for the counterattack, which is Plan B that the Israeli lobby and Israeli.
Essential Israeli position is that there can be no theoretical possible basis for Iran to be able to have a nuclear weapon. You know, as a peace group, let me say, I think that Brooklyn for Peace agrees, broadly stated, with the idea that no country should be having nuclear weapons. They are bad things, and we would like them to go away. Okay. That, of course, includes our country, Israel, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and the other nuclear powers. I mean, we think this across the board. The goal of preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon is a goal I think that all of us really do share. The fact is that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty allows for, quote, the peaceful, unquote, use of atomic energy, whatever that may really mean. Iran, obviously, as a signatory to that treaty, is entitled to its own peaceful use of nuclear power, however misguided that may in fact be. The treaty regime has made compatible this idea of you can be nuclear weapons ready with the idea of not having nuclear weapons. So that counts as nuclear disarmament. We're going to have a very difficult time given the interests of AIPAC, and it's our job as a peace organization to try to mobilize as much as we can in order to deal with that.